That said, that brings me to the person who, quite frankly, I believe should have been the president of the United States, Bernie Sanders. As Israel continues to bombard Palestinians, the international community is increasing their calls to end the violence. Voices ranging from Pope Francis to Joe Biden, the pressure is mounting. Joe Biden is said to have spoken at least 4 times with Benjamin Netanyahu, stating that he expected a cessation in hostilities. It is being reported that Netanyahu has basically just shrugged off the request, ever determined to promote his political career at the expense of the Palestinian people. And while Joe Biden is publicly stating that he wants to see an end to the violence, the United States has once again blocked a United Nations resolution that would use the collective voices of nations all around the globe to call for a ceasefire. Yesterday, Senator Bernie Sanders, took to the floor of the Senate and made a compelling speech declaring that Palestinian lives matter. Let's take a look at that.
Therefore, be it resolved that the Senate urges an immediate ceasefire to prevent any further loss of life and further escalation of conflict in Israel and the Palestinian territories, and supports diplomatic efforts to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to uphold international law, and to protect the human rights of Israelis and Palestinians. I would also like to point out that those of us who are supporting an immediate ceasefire are certainly not alone. We join with nearly the unanimous call from the European Union, with United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, with Pope Francis, and with many others. In other words, all over the world, people are seeing the terrible tragedy that is taking place in the region, and they want an end to it as quickly as possible through a ceasefire.
Now, it's the next part of Bernie Sanders' speech that really resonated with me the most. He specifically calls out Republican Tim Scott, who released a statement stating that Tim Scott stated that he mourns the deaths of the 12 Israeli people killed during this conflict. But Senator Scott said absolutely nothing about the 200 Palestinian deaths, which included women and children. Bernie Sanders took note and called out Tim Scott for this.
Now, I happen to have read Senator Scott's resolution, and I was particularly struck by one sentence in it on page 2. And what it says, and I quote, "The Senate mourns the loss of innocent life caused by Hamas's rocket attacks," end of quote. That's on page 2. Now, I certainly agree with that. And I think every member of Congress agrees with that. The loss of 12 innocent Israeli lives is, in fact, a tragedy. But what about the loss of 227 Palestinian lives, including 64 children and 38 women? Does Senator Scott not believe that the loss of those Palestinian lives, 64 children and 38 women among others, is not a tragedy? I believe that we should be mourning the loss of Israeli life, but we should also be mourning the loss of Palestinian lives. Or perhaps some people think that Palestinian lives don't matter. I would hope not.
That's the thing, James. Like, we've been covering this pretty extensively, and we've seen the footage, we've seen the videos, we've seen the images, and we've heard the stories. And we're getting ready to speak with a student from who's in Gaza right now, and the amount of tragedy, the amount of death, the amount of pain and suffering that's being caused. You would think that people would have at least enough human decency to recognize that there are children and women who are dying on the Palestinian side. But Tim Scott along with so many others. It's not just Tim Scott, but he's the one who was foolish enough to slide. He didn't make a speech about this, right? He slid this in as a statement, and he thought probably he could just enter it into the record and pacify all of his supporters without having to be held accountable for it. But little did he know that Bernie Sanders actually reads these things, and you would think that he would have enough him being Tim Scott would have enough human decency to, while you're recognizing the death, recognize the deaths of women and children. But since day one of this, the number one thing that has stood out the most to me, it has been the number of people who simply don't even recognize the humanity of the Palestinian people. In fact, I've had people, I'm going to be honest with you, I operate a little differently than most people, and shout out to all of our supporters who make what we do possible, because you free me up to speak, you free us up to speak exactly what we believe, how we believe it, when we believe it, with no regard for anyone's influence, anyone's financial influence, and anyone's, the only people we answer to are our supporters and our patrons. Because I've had so many colleagues in this space, several who have reached out to me upset because of our coverage. And to be quite honest with you, at the beginning of this, I just simply felt that I wasn't covering it enough. And, they kept prodding the bear, and they kept ignoring the lives of the Palestinian children and women and children who are being killed. Now, I had to reevaluate who's in my phone, right? Because some of these, you don't deserve access to me if you don't have enough humanity in you to recognize the deaths of women and children, and to be upset with our mild coverage at best, because we're reporting the information as we're getting it. And me personally, I want to connect our audience's humanity with the humanity of the people who are being killed. But I bring up our supporters because there are a lot of people who are in positions in media who cannot, in politics, very specifically in politics, who are not free to speak out about this because their paychecks depend on them making sure that their donors are satisfied and that their donors are not upset. And this is not only this issue with Palestine, this is an issue with so many other stories. I mean, we've been in positions before where we were unable to cover issues of race because the people who are writing our checks didn't want us to keep talking about race. And so there's so many people who, whether or not, I don't know if it's a financial influence, I don't know if, and I bring that up because there is a lot of money. There are a lot of right-wing dollars. AIPAC is a political lobbying organization, and they absolutely pour millions of dollars not only into communities, but they also pour it into this very specific issue. And there are people who I know have a heart for humanity, but because they are dependent on those lobbying dollars, they can't speak out about these issues. And this is no conspiracy theory. This is just a matter of fact. Why do you think Joe Biden has not firmly and unequivocally called for a cessation of the hostilities? Why do you think it is the United Nations, our representative to the United Nations, the United States of America, is blocking a Security Council resolution that would demand a cessation, a ceasefire? It's because of the influence that comes on any issue. It's not just this issue, because there are going to be people who say, oh, Ben, you're being anti-Semitic. Absolutely the hell not. We talk about this all the time in this country. Our politicians are bought and paid for. And when you are bought and paid for, you can't speak out about an issue because, well, you're taking money from the pharmaceutical industry. And of course, you're not going to stand up to big pharma. Simultaneously, or very similarly, if you're taking money from AIPAC, you're never going to speak out on behalf of Palestinian lives because they will pull their money from you. And so it is so empowering to be able to not answer to anybody but people who want us to tell the truth and not give a damn about people who want us to bite our tongue and ignore the humanity of the Palestinian people because, oh, they don't want us to talk about it. Well, I'm glad you don't want us to talk about it. But what I'm happy the most about is that you don't have any impact on what we do on this show. And you will never have any impact on what we do on this show. And we will speak out truth to power. And the more you tell us not to talk about it, we're more prone to talk about it just because you asked us not to.